I wanted to thank everyone for joining us today for this health and wellness panel for the African American Alumni Reunion for the University of Michigan Law School for 2021. On today's Health and Wellness panel, I'm joined by Molly Rands, Director for Lawyers and Judges Assistance Program for the State Bar of Michigan, and Alexis Robertson, Director of Diversity Inclusion for Foley and Lardner. I'm Ronald Falls. I am the moderator, and I'm the Chief Operating Officer for Post Advisory Group, and I'll be navigating us through this panel today. First, I'd like to thank you both for joining us on the panel today. I know 2020 has been an interesting year, and as we move into 2021 and we try to turn the page, in hindsight, one of the things that has been a heavy topic of discussion and consideration in general is health and wellness, and specifically for the legal community and law students as well. This topic has been something that's very timely and relevant. I think that it's an appropriate time for everyone to kind of provide some background and insight on their personal views on health and wellness as we get into the discussion. But first, perhaps you can both tell me a bit about what you do and how health and wellness plays into that.
Molly, do you want to start?
Sure. Thanks so much for having me on, Ron. It's so nice to be here. My name is Molly Rands. I am the director for the Lawyers and Judges Assistance Program at the State Bar of Michigan. And I'm a fully licensed professional counselor. I'm a nationally board certified counselor, and I'm a board certified addictions clinician. And I've been working with LJAP for almost a decade now. So I am very passionate about legal professionals, about their wellness, their mental health, maintaining their well-being, and I'm just really thankful to be here.
We're glad to have you.
As Ron mentioned, my name is Alexis Robertson. I'm Director of Diversity and Inclusion at Foley and Lardner. And so wellness definitely has a connection to diversity in large law firms. So that this does come up in my professional context. But I think one of the reasons I'm here is that I've developed a bit of a reputation for being a geek, I guess, about all things wellness and well-being. And that was a journey I started while I was still a practicing lawyer at Kirkland & Ellis. So I practiced for about 7.5 years before leaving legal practice about 5 years ago to become a D&I professional. And also, because my outside interests are on health, I'm also a certified Whole30 coach, which is a 30-day dietary reset program. But outside of that, I've just been reading lots of books about health and well-being, as well as navigating my own health and wellness related issues, and just happy to share my experience as we talk about this today.
Thank you, and definitely very happy to have you. And my own background in this, I am the Chief Operating Officer for Post Advisory Group. So one of the things I'm responsible for is the human capital portion of what we do at Post Advisory Group. And as you can imagine, in a year like 2020, navigating and managing through a lot of the challenges that we faced, a lot of the issues that were involved in trying to marshal and to make sure that people were okay revolved around health and wellness issues, especially during those most trying times. So getting into the panel, a question for both of you is how do you define wellness, and how can wellness be defined? Molly, I know you have some training in this space. Perhaps you could shed some light on that for us.
Sure, I'd be happy to. Well, we had some research that came out of 2016, really the first research we've had since the 1990s on lawyer well-being, that looked at the prevalence of mental health and substance use issues amongst legal professionals. And that report was published in 2016 by the ABA Commission on Lawyer Assistance Programs, in addition to, or in partnership with the Hazelton Betty Ford Foundation. And because of this research, which was something that we in the LAP world, the lawyer assistance program world, we knew, but kind of seeing those statistics in black and white was pretty astonishing, I think, even for us and for everybody, viewing this information. Out of that, a national task force on lawyer well-being was formed, and they issued a report, The Path to Lawyer Well-Being, Practical Recommendations for Positive Change. And in that report, wellness is really defined. And I love the definition they utilize for wellness, because they look at wellness from a multidimensional perspective. And what that means is they're defining wellness as not just the absence of impairment or not just the absence of illness, but rather thriving in all dimensions of one's life. And, that's an excellent way to look at it, because a lot of times we have folks who think, they're considered well if they're not sick, or if they're not suffering, or if they're not struggling with something. And this definition really says, that's not being well. I mean, that's great, but being well is actually thriving. And so 6 dimensions were identified: social, emotional, spiritual, physical, intellectual, and occupational. And so now when I'm talking to folks, I'm really asking them to look at those dimensions and kind of do a self-assessment. Maybe their emotional well-being is maybe really intact. They're able to regulate emotions, set limits and boundaries. They are receiving help for any mental health struggles that they're experiencing, but maybe their social well-being is pretty low, right? Because we're in the midst of a pandemic and they've maybe lost connection, with some of those folks that they would routinely run into, or maybe the majority of their social interactions came from work, and so they're not in the office. So that definition helps us to understand we need to look at well-being from a multidimensional perspective. We need to look at well-being as not just the absence of illness or impairment, but really thriving, and helps us to understand what types of dimensions of well-being we should be looking at for ourselves. And I think also what that definition does is it helps us to understand then that well-being, for a practicing lawyer is really integral to competence.
Correct. I would imagine that if you spoke to most lawyers and most law students and you use those categories, most would not readily identify those as the categories of their own well-being. So I guess in terms of entering this thought process into the discussion of the conversation, are these terms that you're now starting to use when you have conversations with people in the legal community about their wellness, about well-being, about where they may be situated? Is this going to be more of a common conversation?
Yeah, absolutely. So Anne Bradford, for example, she is a former Big Law equity partner and went back to school and got her PhD in positive psychology. She utilizes these dimensions as well. And she's developed a toolkit for lawyers and legal employers to implement well-being in their firms or in their organizations. And she has this really neat graphic where she takes these 6 dimensions and kind of intertwines them. And LJAP has started to utilize that and really reference that when we're talking with law students, with bar applicants, with lawyers, with judges, because it's such an easy way to kind of look at the graphic, quickly assess, in your own life where your well-being is, and be able to pretty quickly identify, hey, this is maybe, strong for me. I'm doing well in this area, but this area might be lower. So yes, absolutely. I think it's a great tool to be able to utilize when we're talking about well-being. And I think it can be universal. We can all, look at well-being in this manner.
Alexis, when you're talking to individuals at the firm and you're kind of navigating some of these human capital issues, what are you hearing from those categories of the things that people are struggling with most in the terms of these categories of wellness and well-being?
Sure. Although to be clear, I don't often put on the well-being hat in my role, but it certainly is an underlying issue within diversity and inclusion. A couple of things. One, I love the definition that Molly just shared. I love the fact that we're starting to talk about this, but something that we run into, whether it be, and I generally won't speak in too much detail about like the ins and outs of my day-to-day, but when we are dealing with attorney talent, there's a huge disconnect. Like, it's wonderful that we're starting to get the language, but do we actually, it's one, you go to these 60-minute, 90-minute, much like this, a talk on health, and you're kind of like, okay. And is it resonating? Are people listening? I think it's starting to happen more, but I do think as lawyers that so many of us have frankly been taught to ignore our physical states, our emotional states, that we're not necessarily to the point where we're introspective enough or self-aware enough to know if we're running into a problem. And so I think that is an issue that I think organizations face this, but I think law firms especially face this. And even though it's fantastic that we have this working definition that makes it somewhat simple, in many ways it's not that simple, in that if I took any one of those 6 dimensions that Molly just outlined, physical, for example, it is one dimension, but physical health has a number of components, right? So it's sleep, it's nutrition, it's hydration, it's movement. And I think there's a few others. I'm actually, maybe mobility, like there's things I'm missing. And for most of us as humans, as organisms that are a system of systems, if one of those things is off, you could eat really well, but if you don't sleep, you could sleep like a champ, but you don't eat well. And so it's simple yet complex at the same time. And so as Molly was explaining her definition of, or not her, but the ABA definition of well-being, I was thinking it comes down to this, like, are you generally feeling good? How do you feel? And then you can figure out which areas. But I think with attorney talent, it's getting the message, it's getting people to slow down. It's also this, particularly in a law firm, I'm here to bill. So I don't have time. Like, I just don't have time for the rest of this. But also, once again, back to Molly, this coming down to be an issue of competence. You are not as good of a lawyer of a friend, of a parent, name all the things as you would be if you are operating optimally. So that message resonating and delivering it in a way that people can hear, I think is probably the threshold issue.
I definitely think that's things that you see lawyers, begin to grapple and deal with. Sort of being a counselor and advisor and sort of a problem solver for others. You are a recipient of a lot of issues and problems, and you have to think through them and trying to be sharp and provide advice. But you are often, I guess, much in the sense of being a counselor, you're holding a lot of that that you receive in that problem solving. And I'm not sure that lawyers are given tools or taught, at an early stage, how to both receive, process, and deal with that, and also maintain their wellness. As someone who personally has, suffered from a lack of adequate sleep for a long time, and my issues, I would say, definitely predate law school, but definitely law school was an accelerator for some of these habits that, if I'm looking in the physical category and thinking about it, I know that I've probably been operating at a sleep deficit since 2002 when I entered the halls of this illustrious building behind me, and kind of began my journey. Because for me, as you said, Alexis, the idea is that there's a finite amount of time to churn out productivity. And in that time, I have to get as much done as possible. And the more that I get done, supposedly the better that I'm doing. So this optimal output of pushing out work product or things, email, communications, what have you, the idea that I'm doing something, I'm being busy, being of more value to my wellness, because I'm kind of accelerating and moving ahead, than things like rest, sleep, hydration.
The doing. We value the human doing, not the human being. And it's a problem because eventually you're not going to be able to do anymore. Right. So we have to figure out ways to do some of that being part. And maybe we can talk more about that in a bit.
Definitely. Well, I don't think anything is holding us back in terms of getting right into sort of the state of the human being in this instance. Molly, I don't know what your experience is with I guess the buckets of well-being, or the things that you typically see or face as challenges. Are they in the physical space? Are they in the social space for lawyers, the intellectual space, the occupational space? They seem to all blend together. One of the things you were saying, Alexis, earlier is that you lose out in one of these categories and it may blend into some of these other places pretty quickly.
Yeah, absolutely. So, what you just mentioned, Ron, is something I hear about all the time when I'm in law schools, when I'm in firms. There are only so many hours of the day and there are so many things to get done. And so, slowly over time, especially with my students with the students, it's an hour here and there, that if I could just cut 1 hour of sleep out, I can get all of these other things done. It's like, well, what's happening to relationships? What's happening to partnerships? What's happening to exercise? What's happening to proper nutrition and diet? When is the last time you were at your primary care's office for your annual blood work? These types of things. I think there's this idea in the field of law, and I speak, about this not as a lawyer. So I want to make sure I get that out there. But as I'm going around and talking with lawyers and talking with students, there's this idea of time famine. There is so much to get done in such little time. And so it's cramming as much as possible with a total, with not paying attention to mental health, to physical health, to, social activities. And so, maybe folks will say, well, my intellectual well-being or my occupational well-being is really great. I feel satisfied at work. I'm appreciated by colleagues, or, I'm intellectually challenged or stimulated. And so, but that's not it. Those are two dimensions of the six. And so I think that's something that, that we really need to pay attention to, is that, just as Alexis said, it's the whole body, it's the whole human being that we need to be paying attention to. And with that, looking at Alexis made such a good point. How do we get people to hear and understand this information? And I think, she made a really good point of talking about wellness as a form of human capital that really can't be denied, right? So when we're looking at why are we caring about this? First of all, we have to put it in the ways that it's good for business. Healthy and well lawyers, they're good for the bottom line. Research shows that there's greater client satisfaction. It's good for the organization. When you look at, grievances or, issues of misconduct, much of the time those are related, disciplinary actions are related to a lack of wellness. Lawyers that are depressed, that are anxious, maybe they're not responding to client, emails, they're not opening mail, they're not handling cases well. Maybe there are substance use issues that have developed. So it's good for so many different things. And lastly, I think it's humanitarianism, right? It's the right thing to do. We have too many of our colleagues, which we know now from research that we have in black and white, that are struggling with well-being. When you look at the stats for lawyers, it's just astounding. When you look at those statistics, we can't ignore this any longer. I've been with the bar for almost a decade, and I have to say there's been such a turnaround. In the moments, it's felt very slow, but looking at the last 10 years, I can see there's been much change. And right now is a really exciting time, to be talking about this, because I think people are finally paying attention.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was gonna say, I just have so many different things I'd want to say about that. I'm not gonna be able to capture them all, but there's a couple of things going on. So we can talk about it from sort of like the legal profession and what we need to do as a profession to change. I think for presentations like this, really focusing also on what you can do as an individual, because we do hope the overall industry and profession changes, but that's going to take time. But the question is, what can you, walking away from this, do differently to help support your well-being, or to at least, gain a little awareness around it? And just the other day, I heard someone talking about the differences between peak performance and optimal performance.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, someone was actually a former Navy SEAL, and he said people would go up to him, because now he's in that corporate world talking about, leadership and performance in the workplace. And they're like, we just love the fact that, you knew all about peak performance. And he was like, that never quite fit for me, because I don't care about peak performance. I care about optimal performance. And I will explain why I think this matters for lawyers, because I think we're very focused on peak, particularly in our careers. I want to bill the most. I want to get the best result for the client. And we will focus on peak performance to the detriment of all these other things, because actually peak performance, but for short bursts of time, should not be our focus. It should be optimal performance, meaning when I am giving adequate time, attention, energy to these other categories of my life and to work, what does that look like? When I'm firing on all cylinders and everything, versus just giving all of my energy to one thing and then later falling off a cliff. And so I think really having to reframe our focus and to some extent our values, and there's an emotional component in here as well, because we have some industry stuff and some type of people stuff happening, but really understanding that it's one thing for you to live on coffee and little sleep because you have trial, but if that's sort of your MO, you are not going to be able to maintain that. That is not optimal. And optimal really is doing the best you can given the situation. So the Navy SEAL was saying, I'm rarely peak. NFL people in the NFL, they train for peak performance for 4 hours a week on Sunday. For me, I'm happy that I'm able to put one foot in front of the other. That's optimal at that time, given the other things I need to be considering. And so I think as attorneys and just as humans, I'd love for us to reframe it as that versus I have to give everything to work. And then also, let's be honest, for those of you who are billing, the billable hours at odds with much of this. The billable hour does not reward you for efficiency. I hate to say that as someone who works for a law firm. I know the billable hour is not changing, but there are certain things that are built into what we do that can sometimes have a conflict with our wellness goals. But I think instead of, lamenting the system, we have to say, okay, that's how that is. But what can I do? What even marginally can I do to improve that for myself? And this also comes down a lot to just fully taking ownership over yourself and your experience, because nobody else is coming. Like, no one's going to make sure you ate today, drank water today, that you called your mom today. So what can you do to make sure that you did those things?
This in the context of what you're saying, this year is very difficult. One of the things that I noticed about the work year in 2020, and that was most, kind of difficult for people to navigate, was that the work days became longer. Even though we were working from home, it seemed that there was more time, more demands, deadlines were a bit more dramatic. And then you add to that the general sort of discontent that was going on around us outside of just the work-related issues. There's actually a global pandemic. There's civil unrest. And then on top of these things, you're expected in the middle of an accelerated work environment to produce. And you're trying to cope and deal with all of those things. And you have to ask this question about, are you okay, as you are consistently trying to kind of muster something to deliver. We were talking in the context of, work and law firms. And Molly, when you were saying earlier about, how these conversations are having with lawyers, I'm also very curious about, for a person who's going to become a lawyer, a law student, the beginning of their well-being and the way that they learn to identify issues around their wellness and to protect them and form those habits, probably best start when they're in the, indoctrination of becoming a lawyer in the law school environment, where these students have an opportunity to say, hey, these are the things where I can find myself going off the path. And these are the ways that I can start to implement strategies to safeguard my well-being or to course correct when my well-being has come off track. And I can recognize that. One of the conversations that I hope is also, as I said, beginning to happen is that the law schools are focusing on the well-being of law students, that then translates into good habits, good lawyers. When they leave sort of that fertile ground of the law school and go out into the world, they're taking some of these good habits to be, personal ambassadors for their own well-being, as you said before, Alexis. Molly, do you know if there is that research that is also available for the law students in relation to this concept of well-being? Yeah.
Absolutely. So, the 2016 research that came out of the ABA Commission on Lawyer Assistance Programs really demonstrated that there were significantly higher rates of mental health and substance use issues, primarily depression and anxiety, and substance use issues among lawyers than the general population, and not only the general population, but other really high stress professions. So the lawyers they're beating them all when it comes to rates of mental health and substance use issues. And not surprisingly, the same shows for law students. So if you look at, there was a study in 2014 that looks at the survey of law student well-being, and it showed very similar rates to what we see with our lawyers, that a significant number of students are struggling with anxiety, that are struggling with depression, are acknowledging that at the time of the survey, they're experiencing severe anxiety, or debilitating depression. That study that came out of 2014, it surveyed 3,000 law students across 15 diverse different law schools, in the United States, and a quarter of those students, indicated that they were at risk for alcoholism. A quarter.
Oh my God.
6% of the students at the time of the survey in 2014 acknowledged that they had thought about suicide in the past year. So, these are really startling statistics, and we're not surprised that it's in law school, because something, you don't just get a P number and, be admitted to your state's bar and, something dramatically changes. I mean, those things continue on. One of the things when I'm talking to my students, they say, well, Molly, this is just maybe, people that are struggling with mental health and substance use issues are just drawn to the field of law. And that is a great hypothesis, yeah. But we have research that shows that's just not the case. So when you look at research like 2017, for example, Harvard Law did this great study, 886 students, I think. And they looked at that exact question. 66%, I think, of the students said, hey, these troubles, these are brand new to law school. I was not struggling with anxiety, depression, and substance abuse prior to being a 1L. So it's not just that people who are depressed, anxious, and abuse substances want to become lawyers. Something is happening in law school that is resulting in these statistics. And so that's something that we really need to pay attention to. And I will take that a bit further and say the biggest difference we saw between the 2016 Hazelton ABA COLAP study and the most recent study we had, which was in the 1990s, a lot of those stats mirrored, right? We know that lawyers have always been struggling with mental health and substance use issues at higher rates than the general population, at higher rates than other high stress professions like physicians, like surgeons, for example. But the 1990s study showed us that the longer you practice law, the greater your troubles become. And the study in 2016 showed the opposite. So now we know that the highest risk group are those young attorneys, age 30 and younger, first 10 years of practice, those junior associates. And that really makes sense with what we're seeing happen in the law schools. with those rates of mental health and substance use issues. So I just feel like I should mention that, because I think that's something that we really need to pay attention to and focus on as we're trying to come up with some practical recommendations for change with regard to the level of toxicity in the profession.
Well, the other thing to add on, because this is the, Black lawyers or Black alumni reunion, is, and then you add on the stresses of being a person of color, of being a Black person in this country. And I have not seen the research, particularly focusing on Black attorneys as it relates to mental health and substance abuse. I would wager a bet that in terms of maybe the substance abuse, we as a population may not be as high for some other cultural reasons, but in terms of the stress of, being Black in America, of what's happened in this country in the past year or so, that is also affecting us as lawyers, that is affecting us as law students. And there has been a lot of research on the stress of racism, the stress of bias. And then also we add on COVID, which, as we know, is more so affecting people of color, particularly, Black people. I know, I'm not a doctor, so don't take any recommendations from me specifically, but I know I've upped my level of vitamin D after reading all the research about how, Black folks, we have lower levels for lots of reasons. But so it's the research Molly shared, and then it's the realities of what we face as Black law students and Black lawyers that I think requires us to even more so figure out the well-being thing. I think often we'll feel like, well, I can't possibly because I have all these stressors. And I would flip it and say, but can you afford not to in light of all these stressors?
In the sense that you have to do something or take action because you're dealing with these various factors. Anecdotally, I would say to that I think in 2020, that was definitely a conversation that came to the forefront, and it's probably a little bit more painful. As the COO of Post Advisory, I probably see and have access to a lot of information that some folks do not, but I can start to see patterns and trends. So one of the things that I noticed this year after the civil unrest were a lot of our clients were very interested in diversity, inclusion, and numbers. So whereas before there had been a lot of information around the team, what we do, changes in the team, systems we use, and kind of evaluating risk as an asset manager in that regard, this year the question became, well, what does the team look like? What is the composition of the team? Who owns what of your firm and how? What's the progression of that? And the categories that these questions have started to come in under are a lot more granular. I can recall, receiving questions from clients about our diversity metrics, a few years ago, and even last year, they were a bit more high level than they were this year. Now going into the weeds, starting to see some of these things, and we have to answer these questions. So imagine being on, a participant of the executive committee and being the only person in the room that looks like me. And when we're going through responding to these questions, having to say, hey guys, there is some things that we probably need to do differently in response to this, but you have to see this information for what it is. And the world is going to care a lot more. And in that moment, you've got your professional responsibility of I have to navigate the firm into the appropriate space and direction as a business leader. But then I'm also holding the personal disappointment of we're not where we should be. And that personally affects me. And all the while, these other stressors are going on. 2020 was particularly difficult in that regard because I think it brought a lot of systemic inequality to the forefront. So if you are able to see into kind of what's happening across the plateau, Alexis, as you said, disproportionate impact of the COVID pandemic to certain communities of color. That's something that stands out immediately. And you get it both statistically if you're following the information, because we have to follow the stats of what's going on in Los Angeles as a hotbed environment and whether or not I decided to return people back to the office. So I'm following these stats, and I also see the social inequities that we have consistently been pointing to or talking about are now playing out in very tragic fashion, because when we've been talking about inadequate systems, inadequate support, inadequate healthcare, inadequate mental health care, now these things are exacerbated, and you see that from the bird seat. And it's a situation of where something was not being done in the way that you had hoped along the way, but now you see the extreme ramifications of that.
Yeah. And for those of us who operate in majority spaces, it's everything you said, Ron. And then when with George Floyd and this new racial justice movement, as I'll call it, we then got our white colleagues turning to us and being like, wait, there's still racism? Could you tell me about that? Could you explain that to me? And I think I'm only capturing a tiny bit, and I don't want to take us all back to that trauma, but just fully acknowledging the stress load that we have all been through. I say this because I hope it makes us all more sympathetic to ourselves when we maybe find that something is harder right now than it would have been, say, 2 years ago before, we entered this crazy time. Because I think a part of moving forward and a part of the skill set we all need to cultivate well-being, to borrow from Susan David, is emotional agility. So Susan David wrote this fantastic book. It's all about emotional regulation. But part of that is cultivating great empathy for yourself. It's looking at what you've dealt with the pandemic and with, whether it be microaggressions or a racial justice movement or whatever else has happened, and saying, this is hard and it's okay that I'm tired right now. And because I'm tired right now, I will try to, eat a little bit more for breakfast, or I will try to go to bed a little bit earlier. But I do think at the end of the day, a lot of this is that relationship with yourself and having a deep sense of self-compassion. And that, I think, is actually at its core of why lawyers struggle, is we are not self-compassionate. We can have a great deal of compassion to others, but not to ourselves. And we also have some issues with shame, and we're more of a shame-driven profession. And we're actually ashamed to say that we need help or that we're suffering.
Yeah, I think that's definitely one of the things that carries the negative
I see that
needing help. Yeah, please, Mom. Yes.
I see that. And, I think lawyers are expected to have all of the answers all of the time, but never need anything themselves, and so I see that all the time when I'm out speaking. And I love that idea, Alexis, about self-compassion, especially in 2020. It's like we need to look at our expectations and lower them again, and then adjust them. This is not like anything we've been through before with regard to the pandemic. And then, as you mentioned, all the other issues on top of it. I think absolutely that makes so much sense to me. This idea of, I think right now, self-compassion is just absolutely vital, adjusting the expectations we have for ourselves, especially with the ongoing pandemic that seems to never end and all the other issues that we have that we're facing right now. It's just self-compassion is vital.
Self-compassion's been top of mind to me for quite some time. I mean, I didn't know it at the moment, but as I've been on my own health and well-being journey, it actually, in the macro, has been me cultivating a deeper sense of self-compassion to be able to execute on these other more discrete goals, should I say. But I was actually listening. So I listen to a lot of podcasts. I can't help but reference them when I'm talking, but I was listening to an episode of Dan Harris's 10% Happier. And I think he had a meditation teacher on who was a researcher. I'm not sure, but he was talking about self-compassion as sort of that macro habit, that Uber habit, where we will say, I want to lose a few pounds, or I want to do X, but really what would help is to first cultivate more self-compassion, because a lot of the goals we set that we call our health and well-being goals are actually veiled digs at ourselves, right? So you're like, I want to lose weight because I think I'm overweight. Or I want to get this promotion because I don't think I'm excelling the way I should at work. That they'll actually be these veiled kind of negative things. And you can have the same goal, but have it be positively fueled, meaning, so something like, instead of I want to lose weight because I just don't like how my clothes look, or versus I want to lose weight because I really value myself and I want to make sure that I'm here when my grandchildren are born, right? I'm doing it out of this deep sense of love for myself, versus I don't like who I am right now. So in a way, every day as you reinforce this goal, albeit being for your wellness, it's actually you telling yourself how you're some way inadequate. So I think when we kind of strip away all the discrete, like you could sleep more, you could eat better. For me, that is a huge one when it comes to well-being. And actually, and people ask, well, how do I do this? It comes down often to what's that voice in your head? Is it a nice voice? And figuring out ways to first notice the voice. And lawyers are the worst. And I'd be drafting, I'd send an email and I'd reread it and I would be like, oh my gosh, I put a comma where there didn't need to be a comma. It's because I'm an idiot, right? And that voice just got, it's like,
But,
God, you're so
but
dumb.
you know, what did you learn to be conditioned like that? I can tell you firsthand. I remember the first couple of experiences at my law firm, fresh out of law school. After the summer associate experience was gone, making a mistake as a summer associate is definitely different than making a mistake as an associate. You feel the tension differently. And you're sitting in a room and someone looks at you and they ask you a question. You're like, I have no way of knowing this. I went to law school, so I am somewhat prepared to be here. But now we're in the actual practice of law. And you partner have a multitude of years and experience of understanding what it is we're doing. And while it's simple for you, it may not be for me. You make that mistake in the early days, and the scorn that you receive is touching the pot. Makes it very hard for you to not remember that when you go back. The reason you have that anxiety of sending that email is because you've gotten some sort of response at an earlier stage in your career to that mistake.
Yes.
And now you are hardwired to that reaction.
Well, and particularly, as lawyers and as lawyers of color, because we're told you need to be twice as good. So the fact that you, right. And this voice is reinforced by culture. We reinforce it. It's reinforced by our parents.
Yes.
And so without judging where it came from, but knowing that, this was put into you somewhere, you were taught this, there is that question of, would I not be as good of a lawyer if I was a little bit nicer to myself? If I saw that I had made that error in my email and said, okay, noted, you're going to learn from this. And and I know you can do better, Alexis, versus being like, it's because you're an idiot, Alexis. Right. But I think, and that's just one example, but I think most people, I'm assuming those watching this have that experience. But what I've found is I keep alluding to my own health journey, the voice in my head is not mean to me. She's nice to me. She's compassionate to me. She talks to me the way I would talk to a friend. And the ability to, I think, slowly over time, because this is life's work stuff. This isn't wake up tomorrow and do it stuff. But to be more compassionate to yourself is what will allow you to say, I should get up and eat lunch. Because if I was advising a friend, I would say, you should eat lunch today, Alexis. I should drink some water. I should try to go for a walk. And so that sort of thing, I think, is what we can all do as individuals. And it's, baby steps, it's incremental change, but over many years to hopefully affect our well-being. I also can get super nerdy about discrete, like, you should drink this much water. And if you're looking at your diet, consider these things. But ultimately, I really do think it's cultivating and changing that voice so that you can, frankly, just kind of just love yourself more, because nobody else is going to step in there and do it for you the way that you could.
Like Alexis is saying, if she's taking care of herself, then that makes her an emissary for well-being. People are seeing her take care of herself, and she's sending that message that it's an important thing to do.
Well, and taking it home, it allows you to fully show up for other people. And that goes back to, here's why your work product's better. Because when I'm sitting down to draft that brief, I'm hydrated, I had a decent amount of sleep, I'm not hungry, and I'm able to, read that case more closely or that contract more closely. Or when that client calls, hopefully I'm able to really be in the moment with that client versus having a bunch of other things going through the back of my mind, because you can, and this I think is why lawyers will eventually hit a wall, and many do. Most of the lawyers who are huge advocates for health, they've slammed into a brick wall at some point, because your body eventually will revolt in one way or another, and we don't want it to be while you're on a client call. Back to that's bad for business. But I'm sorry, Ron, go ahead.
No, that was totally it. I was just going to say that this all kind of fits into my understanding, Alexis. Some of the things you were saying about where we receive that programming in our mind culturally is so astute. I mean, my mother just had this conversation with me this week about how you have to excel and accelerate. And, the conversation was in the context of what's kind of going on in the greater, scheme of things in the country right now. But it was a repetitive point of input and advice that I've heard from my mother since I was a child. And it's funny, sitting at this place at, 42 years of age, and I've kind of, for all intents and purposes, made my way in a direction. But it's the affirmation again. You've still got to hit harder. You still got to run faster, and it's a mindset. And sometimes it is detrimental to your health and well-being, because you keep just trying to go instead of stopping and doing a self-assessment and saying, I'm not okay. And being okay with the fact that I'm not okay. And now that I know that I'm not okay and I'm saying I'm not okay, what are going to be the things that I'm going to identify to help improve my state of well-being for myself and move in a different direction. What I'm hopeful for, and the thing I wanted to kind of point to about the 2020 and the global pandemic, the civil unrest, and all the things that are kind of happening, is I'm hopeful that this year, as difficult as it was, forced a lot of people to have some of these conversations, and just our like normal existence. I talk with a lot of my friends from college and law school via GroupMe. That I would say is my most common social media outlet. And the GroupMe conversations are usually grouped by subject matter. So we may be talking about politics in one GroupMe, college football in another, basketball, current events, music. But the conversation that is constantly being had in 2020 was about where people were at. Are you okay? Are you checking in on people? Have you talked to someone today? Are you interacting? Because we've been so isolated, restricted from traveling, restricted from engagement, restricted from socialization, and that's a responsible thing. But the human experience also requires a level of interaction and socialization. Whether you're a child learning how to regulate your behavior and interact and play with other, children, and building on that sort of tool set, or if you're an adult that just needs interaction with other human beings for a solid sense and space of where you're at, that's been taken away from us. So these GroupMe conversations have been interesting because I feel like more people are talking about health and wellness, and particularly their own health and wellness, how it affects them, where they may be, what they may not be doing well. And so it's interesting. So like the conversations have been different because I think they've started in the context of other things. So we talked about Peloton a lot this year. Peloton had a remarkable year. But if you were a person that premised your fitness on an outside gym and you didn't adapt your habits to the environment, and perhaps you say, I'm going to get back to this when this is over. I'm going to get back to this habit when this is over. And you're not consistently, taking care of your health and well-being, and maybe in the places you're doing it well along the way, you lose it. So, Peloton comes along this year and everybody's like, oh, I can't go to the gym. And then a couple of folks get a bike. And then they start doing that and they realize it was funny at first, it was a social fad, but then it started to kind of add to a system of well-being and maintenance of well-being.
Yeah.
You're getting on the bike, you're socializing, you're riding with friends, you're talking and interacting about it. And all of a sudden you've built a good habit for yourself. And hopefully you can kind of build on that. I didn't see that before 2020. The conversations definitely changed amongst my friends.
It's been interesting. So 2020 in many ways built a lot of connection, but even going back to what you were saying earlier on about, that always wanting to drive forward the next level, that back to the sort of that peak performance, what can I do more of? And so, to be clear, there's nothing wrong with that. We want some element of drive for the next goal because that will serve you. But I think for many of us and for our profession, that is it's out of balance, right? It does need to be counterbalanced with knowing that it's okay to rest, knowing that it's okay to reflect. And just, I don't know, being a human is interesting because it's hopefully for most of us, it's, 70, 80, 90 years, which is sort of a long time. And so if you did took 6 months to take your foot off the gas, to enjoy where you are, I would submit that would be okay. And most of us, in fact, actually are in a state of stasis, but we're always telling ourselves we should be doing the next thing, which is just unhealthy and in some ways disjointed with reality. So I think having that or understanding that it's okay it's okay to, and that's I would say you have to almost like unprogram yourself to be able to feel confident doing that. But then also what you said, Ron, about 2020, I know for me personally, I had to sort of trigger all of my self-care coping things. And one of those things was I just had to start saying no to a lot of like Zoom meetings, for example. Like if something was in the evening, I had to say no. I've been on Zoom for 10 hours today. I am not okay right now. And not feeling bad because I had to, but there were many things like that where I had to go back to basics and be like, you need to make sure you're eating a certain way. You need to make sure you're getting adequate sleep because the stress of just the psychic stress of the year was so great. And I think when we can't put our hands on exactly what we're like, I should be fine, I'm safe, I'm in my house. But it was just like it sucked energy from you, and you had to recognize that.
I agree. I definitely agree. The magnitude of the stress was constant. And I think even as things kind of ebbed and flowed throughout the year, every new news cycle or update presented another trigger or, point of activation.
Absolutely.
Even if you had gotten to a point of, I'm okay now. And then it's like, well, wait, what happened today? Oh, yeah.
And learning how to regulate the consumption of that content is like a huge part of health this year, I think.
Yes.
If you look at, the body's response to like severe trauma, when you're in a fight, flight, or freeze state, and what's happening in the brain, the billions of neurons that are firing, your body goes into this, this ability to kind of manage this, traumatic situation. What do you do when you don't have any time to reset from that? I mean, we've essentially been in a flight, fight, or freeze since March of 2020 with ongoing pandemic, civil unrest, political struggles. I mean, it's just been constant. And so when your body has no time to reset, it's just this feeling of exhaustion. I would get through the day and think, why am I more tired? So much, why am I so exhausted, so depleted when I'm doing the same things that I would be doing in the office? Why is this so much more exhausting? I don't know, maybe because I'm in the midst of a pandemic, or I have a first grader in the next room on remote schooling, or a 4-year-old downstairs who, her daycare is closed. So we're just dealing with so much that it's never ending. It's the physical, emotional, and mental exhaustion of having no end in sight, essentially, at this point.
Well, and it creates exhaustion, and also numbness, not feeling anything. Can also be a big sign that you're being really affected. And I think, and also so that we can be, give some helpful tips and not just be a downer, you have to figure out how to stop that stress cycle. And what can happen is, I think of it as like a computer with a lot of tabs open. Like one, it's like a work thing happened, and then you read the news, and then your friend sent you that article, and you've opened all of these tabs. You don't close any of them. So I recently read, I didn't finish it, but I read this book called, it's titled Burnout: Overcoming the Stress Cycle. And what it actually talks about, getting into what Molly was saying with our fight, flight, or freeze. So our sympathetic state versus our parasympathetic, which is that rest and digest sort of chill state. The body doesn't understand what's going on. The body doesn't know if you're being chased by a tiger, or if you just read a really stressful article. You have to take the time to tell your body it's okay.
Yeah.
And you can actually complete a stress cycle without the whatever's going on in the world changing. And so that can be by doing a lot of things. This book actually lists a number of things. It could be things like laughter. It could be a hug. It might be meditation. But recognizing that you have a lot going on. And if you never take the time to tell your body, usually through physical cues, that we're safe, those tabs all stay open, and they just add to that sense. I keep pointing this way because that's where I see Molly. They just add to that sense of exhaustion and depletion. And it goes back to why we really have to take charge as individuals, because yes, you can get delivered content such as this, or your workplace can do it. But unless you take the time to physically indicate that I am safe, that it's okay for me to switch into parasympathetic mode, to tell my body, okay, rest, digest, those tabs will stay open. And what happens is, as human beings, is we accumulate that stress over the course of years. You've left 472,000 tabs open for 22 years. And now we have a problem, right? Because you can operate at max stress for a very long time before there's a real issue.
I think one of the greatest things that I've heard on this panel today is the amount of resources and the information that you guys have provided. And I've noticed that you guys are also articulating that you consume information, that you're also, reading up on these things and educating yourselves and informing yourselves about your wellness and your well-being. I want to be sure that we're going to gather some of those pieces of information, those links, and we're going to make them available to the attendees of the reunion, because I think that this conversation is very timely, very pertinent. I don't have any definitive answers or directions in terms of what to give, the attendees, but I want them to recognize this conversation and to hear the various aspects of it. There's so many different parts of wellness and well-being and health that have kind of come out today, and all these different facets are important in different ways. But I think the thing that I've heard from Alexis that is also very important is that the person who's going to know where you are at in that moment best is going to be you. And the person who has to have the most honest conversation with yourself about where you're at and if you need help and if you're not okay is going to be you. So what I'm hopeful of is that we're able to provide this insightful conversation and discussion around health and wellness, particularly as it pertains to lawyers, law students, and recovering lawyers, if you will. And some of these resources that are available for that process of owning your journey about your health and wellness and making some decisions about what you want to do in terms of formulating habits or in terms of getting help if you realize that you are not okay. There are a lot of people who are experiencing similar things. And I think the cruelty of 2020 and sort of the pandemic lockdowns that people were experiencing these very similar feelings and traumas in silos away from one another. The ability to kind of share in that you're not alone is one of those things that's been kind of taken away from us by circumstance. But I'm hopeful that this will be an opportunity for people to self-evaluate and then to make some healthy choices about safeguarding themselves. I want to give you both an opportunity to leave any parting comments or direction or information that you want to share about health and wellness, your own personal journeys, your professional journeys, what have you.
Sure. Molly, do you want to go first?
Sure. I would just say that kind of like Alexis said earlier, it doesn't need to be all, doom and gloom. That, the time to act is now. We know that. But that if you look back at even the last 10 years, which in the grand scheme of things is such a short period of time, there's been so much change already with regard to the awareness of well-being in the legal field. And so, personally, each person individually, needs to kind of own this as their responsibility to analyze their own mental health, see where they are, and start talking about it. I mean, I think that the biggest issue I see with my, with the law students, with the lawyers, with the judges, is this fear of somebody's going to find out, somebody's going to find out that I might not be okay, or, somebody's going to find out that I'm not perfectly well. And so I think what we need to do is destigmatize help seeking. We need to destigmatize this as a negative by talking about it, being an emissary like Alexis talked about. So, managing your own wellness and mental health and talking about it with colleagues, talking about it with friends. And I think it does, need to come from the top down. So, people identifying the stakeholders, are you a stakeholder? Are you the head of a firm? Are you in, the regulatory agency? Are you, what role do you have and how can you make a difference? Making connections with resources like your state's Lawyers Assistance Program. Almost every state has one. We're happy to come out and present and talk about these issues in wellness and just bringing it to the forefront, making people feel like it's okay to talk about these things. We're all in the same boat with regard to, struggles with mental health and substance use or, difficulties with well-being. We know that we're not alone. And so talking about it, being an emissary for well-being, destigmatizing help seeking, these are the things that we all have the power to do. So we can make change. And even though it feels slow, change is happening. And it's an exciting time.
Definitely.
I suppose I would just reiterate what I said earlier, particularly when, looking at, other Black lawyers or Black law students. We have to take our health seriously. Everybody should, but we encounter so much because of the history of this country, what's going on in America right now. And so I would, as I said before, instead of saying that's why I don't have the time, flip it and say that's why this has to be the highest priority, because I hope it doesn't sound negative, but like no one else is coming to do this. So as Molly said, we have to really take ownership of this. But, as Black folks in America, we're doing a lot of work right now. And so a resource that I also mentioned earlier and that we can put in the materials that we share, I really like Susan David's Emotional Agility. It is Harvard Business Review approved. That is the origin of that book. So if you feel uncomfortable, just know Harvard Business Review said it's okay. But that's a great book. Otherwise, follow Susan David on social media or look her up. If you're into podcasts, look up her name. You can then listen to her as you wash dishes. But she will give you some tools to help cultivate self-compassion, so that maybe if you're a little bit kinder to yourself, you can start work on some of these habits that ultimately will massively impact your well-being, so that we can keep doing the work that all of us are doing, whether it be with our families or with our employers. So yeah, that's what I will leave everybody with, at least for now.
Thank you. Molly, Alexis, I want to thank you both. This has been an extremely exciting discussion. I've learned quite a bit myself, and I definitely have some takeaways. I hope that this has also been fulfilling for everyone who's attending this. This has been a lot of fun. So this health and wellness panel, we're going to conclude here. Hopefully there's some information that was useful to everyone, and there will be some materials that will be provided as well, so you can have an opportunity to follow up and read on some of the things that we were talking about today on your own time. So I want to thank everybody for attending today.
Thanks so much, Ron.
Thanks for having me. Thank you.